Okay. So hi everybody. Welcome to the end of the end. This is the shear on the Sefirah most associated with endings, the Sefirah of manifestation, of actualization. We've seen throughout the course of this class that when we talk about the Sefirot, we're not really actually talking about discrete things. We're talking about faces, facets, aspects that reveal themselves in an ever presenting, ever turning, ever even evolving um, essence in the divine. That God shows us different aspects of what God is so that we can relate, so that we can connect. And not just that, but they're not static, they're dynamic nodes. They're stages in a process. They're way stations of sorts. We've seen that the Sefirot are not things, but are rather moments of flow. That they're moments of both. Every sphera has two faces: one that receives and one that bestows. One that is mekabel and the other that is mashpia. Malchut, also known as the Shekhinah, you'd think would be strictly mekabel, because it is the end point of the process of all of the 10 spheros, bringing down the shefa, bringing down the flow from the source. But we forget that we too are part of this process, that we are actually then receiving from Malchut. So even Malchut is both receiving from above and bestowing below. And then you'd say, okay, so then we are now actually in the position of realizing what it means to be in this system. That everything you think is actually at the bottom is actually at the top of something else. That there's nothing ever really that stops. The process doesn't really end. Even we are on top of the created world of sorts, and then underneath us is that which is in our care, are the things that need our attention. And not just that, but also we know that with every sphera, it doesn't just go one direction, Korean pop bands aside, but they actually, no, sorry, Western pop bands aside. Apology. I'm not okay. I'm not like Bucky and pop bands. Pardon me. Um, not yeah. Harry Styles. Is that one? Is he in One Direction? Okay, good. So Harry Styles. So One Direction aside, the spheras also don't just receive or even bestow, but they actually all reverse flow as well. That the flow comes down into this created world, and then it also gets sent back up as we return what God bestows to its source. So Malchut, which appears to be the end of the line, right, the last station in the subway of God, ends up actually, like every end of the line, is also the beginning of when the train goes back the other way. So every ending is also a beginning. We see this actually manifested in an image that's especially popular in the teachings of the Rebbe, the late 7th Chabad leader, who stressed that, riffing on things other Chabad rabbis had said, stressed that the crown of Malchut, which is also called Ateret, tiara, ends up encircling and becoming a crown for Keter, right? Interestingly, right, what the beginning of this process is called Keter, a word for crown, and the end of the process is also called Atara, a name for crown, showing that actually perspective of our hierarchy is really dependent on our own vantage point. Whereas in truth, because truly there's actually not an order between these spheros, that's just the way that we see them, the top is the bottom and the bottom is the top. Every sphera is involved in each other. So when we talk about how Malchut is the last sphera or the bottom sphera, I want us to do that in a way that acknowledges the complexity of what this system entails. That how can we really describe an infinite object like God? Notions of top and bottom, first and last, have to be undermined for them to have any meaning when we speak of God. So I want to talk about, and maybe this isn't a surprise by now because I always liked finding these stiras, these contradictions. I want to talk about Malchut in its linguistic sense, because the word that means kingship or kingdom, sovereignty. but also where we find ourselves in relationship to it. What does it mean to manifest sovereignty? What does it mean to manifest ourselves? What does it mean to actualize our potential? Malchut is the actualization of all of the potential, all of the potency, all of the power that is coursing through the system, and it comes through in Malchut. We saw that last week when we talked about Yesod. We talked about Yesod as that moment of actualization, channeling it all through. And Malchut is where it happens, where it all becomes real. And not accidentally, I also want us to, when we have a chance to talk personally, I also want us to think about what does it mean to take all of this woo-woo, tutti-frutti, up in the air stuff that we've been learning, and what does it mean to actually bring it into our real lives? What does it mean to really commit to the process and to the practice of what Sefirot ha-Omer has entailed for us? What does it mean to really not finish the process as something that we will be doing throughout our entire lives, but what does it mean to really actually, I think, make some kind of sense of progress? To set down your markers on the road, to say, you know what, I got here. And that sets a good station for where we're going in the future. Okay. So I want to make sure we're grounded, as always, though, in the text of Tanakh. So we'll begin by looking at a few psukim, a few verses. So this is one of the last verses of the Tanakh, of at least the first book of Chronicles, the last chapter of the first book of Chronicles. Chronicles is an alternative historical text of chronicling the kings of Judah and Israel. It presents a largely like recap of what was going on in Malachim, but with some interesting choice differences. And so here we have a pasuk that probably a lot of us are familiar with because we read it every time the Torah comes out. But now it's going to mean something very differently to us, because it actually is, in truth, Sefirot ha-Omer. What? Aha. So, Lecha Shem ha-Gedula v'ha-Gevura v'ha-Tiferes v'ha-Netzach v'ha-Hod. To you, God, is the magnanimity, the power, the beauty, eternity, glory. Ki chol b'shamayim v'aretz, everything in heavens and earth, Lecha Hashem ha-Mamlacha v'ha-Mitnaseh lechol harosh. To you, God, is sovereignty and ascendant over the top of all. So Gedula, which actually I think we mentioned before, is a cognate for chesed. Gedula is another way of saying kindness. I translate magnanimity because like magnitude, bigness, right? Gedula, like gadol. It means like having large-heartedness. So to you, God, it's chesed, gevura, tiferet, netzach, and hod, taking us all the way through the first 5 weeks of Sefirot ha-Omer. Kichol b'shamayim v'aretz, kol, as we talked about last week, everything, the allness, is another way of talking about Yesod. So we have chesed, gevura, tiferet, netzach, hod, Yesod. And then we get to mamlacha, which is a cognate for Malchut. So we have this process of actually what it means for the shefa of God to be flowing through these different nodes, manifesting in mamlacha. And I think the point of the reason we're talking about the word Malchut is used here because that is what it means to realize what it is that's coursing through this system, that we're actually bringing it into existence. Malchut is a sphere of power. It's a sphere of power, but interestingly, the word for power in Hebrew, koach, it's also the word for potential. And indeed, actually, we see that in English too. Potency, the English word potency, comes from the word, it has the same root as the word potential. So when we talk about power, what we're talking about is a capacity to do something, the ability to do something, the energy to do something. But that's a different thing than saying doing it. Malchus is doing it. Malchus is having the power to make a decision, to make policy, to influence and impact people's lives, to organize your society. That's sovereignty. Right? Power is responsibility, according to the great Rabbi Stanley. So, and we see that in the next verse. This next verse is not read on when we take out the Torah, but I think it's very important. That's why I wanted to list it. Va'osher ve'kavod milfanecha, wealth and dignity, right? Money, which is a way that we have influence in this world, and social prestige are yours. V'ata moshel bakol, and you govern all. In your hand is power and strength, and in your hand legadel ulechazek lakol. It's in your hand to cultivate, to cause to grow, to develop, maybe is a good word for saying that. Like, think of like development, like in urban planning, right? To develop and to empower all. That's what power entails. To develop others, to lead to their growth, to contribute to their growth, and to give them strength and sustenance for them to be able to stand. So power is on one hand the ability to influence others, to manifest what you believe, what you think is right, to bring it into the world. But it also comes tailored with, or comes with, a sense of obligation, right? Noblesse oblige. I think an idea, I will not defend feudalism on this video, but I will say that our current models of what it means to have power and influence are ones without any sense of noblesse oblige. So I wouldn't say we should go back to feudal estates or what have you, but it's a different kind of impoverishment we have nowadays, in which you just you leave your money in the bank and no one should tell you what to do with it. There's no sense of actually the way in which you have obligations towards others, which should contribute toward or determine the way you act it. Okay, so power is on one hand the ability to act, not just ability to act, but not just the potential to act, the possibility to act. Enactment. But power is not morally neutral in Torah. Power has a course of wisdom, and this is why the Sefirot start with will, which is keter, but then immediately flow into wisdom and understanding. Will is arbitrary. I decide it, right? It's just what it is. I can will anything. Unicorns, I willed it. But chokhmah and bina temper your will. Direct it towards a sustainable model of engagement, such that what actually the next thing that comes out of wisdom and understanding, also not morally neutral, it's love. So we go from will, which is anything, right? The power to do anything. I decide. It's arbitrary, but it's tempered by wisdom and understanding, your mind and your heart. And then the way it starts to manifest is love. So kindness is not a neutral factor, and it's not actually irrelevant in the sense that even though keter, ratzon, will, is beyond these measurements, beyond these adjudications, and yet it's also love. It also is associated with love. Chesed is kindness, but will is love, right? It's like you can't explain how you fell in love with somebody. Because oh, I love this person because they're responsible, because they're a good parent, because they are funny. Sure, but A, that's a lot of people. And B, I don't think you'd really say that's why you love somebody. Right? There's something irreducibly singular about love that is kind of arbitrary, right? It can't be universalized. It can't be explained. It can't be explained away. You can't convince somebody to love you, as much as a nerd might want that to be true. What you can do is enter with an open heart and with a sense of, I would say, a sense of radical attention. Attention is also not actually determined. Attention attends to anything. So, power is capacity to act, possibility of change, but coming with this push, the essence of God, the loving essence of God, towards goodness to others. Okay, so power is not just its own, might does not make right in Torah. Might is directed towards right. We have Rashi on this, and very nicely actually bringing in a little bit of La Français ancien, bringing in some old French. He says, and here's an interesting point. And I want us to be caught in this, right? Because I want us to be caught in this knot of power. Because I really do think like now especially we are so beset by, I think, a fear of power that we'd rather be right than be in charge. Because having power is messy. It's much more morally neat to be enacted on, acted upon. You have excuses. You're caught in a system. And while all of that's true, we are constantly being acted upon. But the risk, the potential risk of taking that chance, of trying to make a real difference. Imagine what the Twitter mob will say, right? As everyone picks you apart and critiques everything you do. We've created a world of spectators, which I think has really made it much harder to act. And I think Malchus I want to find in Malchus a way to act with care, act with temperance, and act with a deep sense of responsibility. So I want us to be caught in the sense of both power, its potential danger, and its responsible enactment. So Rashi says that the meaning of this note of is that melech, right? If there's a king who gives to the king's minister, servant, authority, right, to rule, then the servant, wherever the servant is, but in that way, then the kingdom doesn't really belong to the king anymore. And the one to whom the kingdom belongs does not have the servant. So we have this risk here, right, of, what's it called? Assignment, like assigning roles, delegation, right? If a human king delegates to a vassal, right, a vassal liege, then the king is losing power. Right, we see this all over, back to feudalism, right? We see it all over in the history of medieval Europe, is that the king was constantly taking a risk, because you could only have power on one hand to have these like vassal lords distributed throughout your far reaches of empire. But on the other hand, you don't control them. They have authority and independence on their own. The only way people know you're the king is because your face is on the money. Right? So power has never been this easy thing to possess for human beings. To delegate means to lose. But for God's delegation is an agent of God. And also, the domain is God's. And therefore it says, Lecha Hashem hagedula v'hagvura v'tiferet v'netzach v'hod. Lecha Hashem hamlacha v'nisei l'chol harosh. So here Rashi is trying to, I think this might be pseudo-Rashi, but someone from the Rashi school is trying to say, there's something distinct about what God's power entails. It's because God is infinite, God can't lose. The kinds of like power-based calculus, right, the risk reward calculus that human authorities, CEOs or whatever have in terms of what it means to share power, is not true of God. But I would also say it shouldn't be true of us either if we're acting in a godly way. Because human power is for retention. The point of human power is to have it. The point of divine power is to use it. The point of divine power is to make the world, to renew the world, to keep the world going. A divine consciousness of power, to identify with Malchus, is not to be, like hashtag the boss. It's to be an agent of God. It's a space in which divinity is happening. A venue for justice. A venue for how to use what you have at your disposal towards the betterment of others. So a divine model of power is one that's not concerned about retention, because once you conceive of actually like what it means to be partaking of divinity, of the infinity of God, you can't lose it. It's infinite, right? If you divide infinity by 2, it's still infinity. So to share godliness, to share God's power, God sharing God's power is not a loss. It's not subtractive. It actually multiplies. That's what's incredible about it. Dividing God multiplies God, because you've distributed God more. You've created more opportunities for divinity in this world. You know, the president of the shul emailed me and said, like, hey, there's a member Frank Spitzer, who gives a beautiful, eloquent drasha every year for Yizkor. Every time we have Yizkor, he gives the Yizkor speech. And he emailed me saying, like, hey, like, the Frank's going to give a Yizkor speech for the newsletter. We're going to write a Yizkor address for the newsletter. He said, I hope that's okay. I think it's really important to empower the community. And I wrote back and I said, yes, 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 of course. Because after many, many years of me getting over myself, and it's a continuous process, I finally was able to learn, oh, it's not about me doing it. It's about me facilitating what it means for others to be participating and be contributing. Like, once you get over the anxiety of ego, you get to celebrate how much more is happening. What other sparks of God are able to flourish because you have what you can do, and that's great. And if you can help others do what they can do, that's more great. That's additive. So when you actually, quote unquote, think you're subtracting from yourself, you are. But when you realize what it means to divide divinity is actually additive and multiplicative, then you realize that what it means to share the wealth is to create more spaces for God's influence in this world. So that's something that's deeply special about God's relationship to power and what a godly relationship to influence entails. All right, another big pasuk. This one also we should know from Shacharis and from Mincha, and then also from Ne'ilah on Yom Kippur. Malchuscha malchus kol olam memshaltecha bechol dor vador. Your malchus is a malchus for all eternities, all worlds. And your sovereignty, your dominion, your governance is for each and every generation. And that shows, by the way, mostly, again, the word olam in the Bible is for time. It's not primarily for space. So your dominion is dominion for all eons, and your governance is for each and every generation. Okay. So here we have the Ibn Ezra, who is one of our most linguistically attentive meforshim. And Ibn Ezra says, Malchuscha, because I want to laser in on this notion of Malchus. So I mentioned before, there's a zillion names for the Shekhinah. If you find like a word that's clearly referring to some aspect of God, 9 times out of 10, it's probably the Shekhinah. And there are a lot of really special names, like the Holy Apple Orchard, Water, the Queen, the Bride, Lower Tshuva, Lower Judgment, Accessible Fear. All these, there's a zillion terms for Shekhinah. But I want to focus on Malchus because I think Malchus is really the most associated with what it means to actualize, to manifest, to bring into this world, the practice of power, the practice of what it means to actualize what we've been talking about these past bunch of weeks. So, Malchuscha, says Ibn Ezra, Kol Malchus tifsak, u'Malchus Hashem omedes lenetzach. So, all bracket human power, human sovereignty will end. But, and here we see a great example of how Vav is not just conjunctive but disjunctive, right? Vav is not just and, it also can mean but. But Malchus Hashem, God's sovereignty, stands forever. Okay? So Malchuscha. So here he's really stressing that we see Malchuscha your Malchus, God, what it means for you to manifest. All right, that's a nice sweet point, not hard. Here you have the Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi, another very linguistically attentive Meforish, and he has a Perush on Nach. He doesn't really show up as much. We don't have as much on him on Chumash. It says Malchuscha. He also has a point. He says Eina Malchus Ben Adam. So agreeing with Rashi, right? Both of them are making this disjunctive point vis-a-vis Rashi. It's not like the sovereignty of a human being, which has a limit, it has a hefsek, either in terms of someone's life or in their death, right? That's one way that the sovereignty of a king ends. They die. Aval malchus kel yisparach, but the kingship of God, ein la hefsek, has no limit. Ki malchusoi malchus kol olamim, kol hazmanim. V'kefel ha'inyan b'milos shonos. Says the sovereignty of God has no limit because God's sovereignty is for all. I think here he actually might mean worlds, like throughout all of space and all of time. And kefel ha'inyan, they double the term malchuscha malchus. Why is this term double? Why isn't just malchuscha kol olamim? Why do we have to reemphasize the word malchus here? He says, and the word is doubled. B'milos shonos. Why? I think what he's saying is because it's showing that there is no aspect of this world, of this reality, in which God's presence is not felt, in which God's dominion is not enacted. That we have a continuity of divine presence throughout every single aspect of creation. So here I think now we have a new aspect of what this means. Because we started with a description of what it means for God's illimitable, unlimited power and sovereignty. And now we actually have a point that very subtly is pointing to the fact that there is a practice of attention for us to find the ways in which God is present in the different aspects of this world. Because there's no space or time, no dingy corner of this universe in which God is not. So where is Malchus? Oh, it's everywhere. And then we're left with a deeply powerful challenge. So here's another famous Melucha pasuk: Ki lashem Melucha moshel b'goyim. To God or for God, belonging to God, proper to God is sovereignty, kingship, ruling over the nations. So here we bring in, so we talked about space, talked about time, and now we're going to talk about the social. Right, God's presence in society. Something that's tricky to talk about in a democracy, which separates, church and state. But what does it mean, I think, for us, let's say for a non-fundamentalist account of what it means to find the divine in human affairs, in the social, and in the political? Because I think actually, interestingly, the split mind of the modern Orthodox pattern of relationship is that oh yeah, there's the place where I do Judaism, and then there's my job. And I think it's a healthier relationship to Torah, and to actually, I think it heals our souls to be able to synthesize more. What does it mean for me to bring Torah, to bring Yiddishkeit, to bring midos, to bring my values, to bring Musar, right? To bring what it means for me to develop as a person into my whole life. So Malchus, I think, really does commit us to following up on the wholeness, the allness, the totality of Yesod we were talking about last week. What does it mean for me to really try to synthesize my life into something whole? To bring, not just to recognize and to bring divinity into all of it. So, here we have a text that we've mentioned, we've discussed a few times. This is the Sha'arei Ora by Yosef Chiktilia, his exploration of all of the Sefirot on the pattern of ascent, going all the way up, right? Starting from, that's why the last Sefirah is actually his first gate. So we see again, last and first are really a matter of perspective. And in it, he's talking here, focusing on the name Malchut. And he says, Ulafisha Amida Hazos hi Moshelas al kol hanivraim ba'olam. So this is the notion that why is God called Malchus here? Because this aspect of God is the governor of, this is what, this is when we talk about hashgacha, God's turning the crank of reality, right? Keeping the universe going. Lafisha Amida, this is the thing that governs all created things in the world. V'hu parnas hagadol shekol yitzurim tzrichim lo. The great sustainer. All created things need it. Nikres b'Torah bilashon malchus. And in the Torah, this aspect of God is called malchus. Lefisha kol inyanei hamelech Hashem v'chol ma'asav kulan asin al yedei midazu. Because all the ways that we talked about God as king, all of it is actualized through this midah. Where we talk about God as king, right? Hamelech HaKadosh, the holy king, Avinu Malkeinu, right? This is the aspect of God, in a sense that, again, it's not that we're praying to God, but that we are able to receive as a face that we can recognize. Right? Sephiros give us language to address God, ways of imagining God, because God is beyond our names, beyond our recognitions. Right, we saw that pasuk just right here. Right, to God is malucha, sovereignty, governs the nations. The inyan malucha ve'adnut, this notion of kingship, sovereignty, mastery, kulam mori memshala v'shiltonut. All of them indicate, signify, right, power, sovereignty, governance, and authority. Ella, sheshem Adonai. So the name Aleph Daled Nun Yud is associated with whom? Shechina. So important to know that every time, and there's a reason this is the pasuk that is before the Amida, when you say Adonai sfatai tiftach ufi agiti latecha, this is the aspect of God that to whom we're drawing our energy, to whom we are facing. Adonai Aleph Daled Nun Yud. This is an amazing Kabbalistic thing, is that when we utter the name of God, the Shem Meforash, and you see this actually in Mizrahi prayer books especially, and Kabbalistic prayer books, we read the letters Yud Kei Vav Kei, but we say the letters Aleph Daled Nun Yud. So we, with our eyes, read the Kri, the Ktiv is Yud Kei Vav Kei, but what we utter is the name Adonai. The sound is Malchut. The letters are Kadosh Baruch Hu, right? Because the name Yud Kei Vav Kei is associated with Tiferet. So when we say the word Adonai, reading it from our prayer books, reading it from the Torah, we are actually, in every little moment, we're bringing togetherness, we're bringing unification between Kadosh Baruch Hu and Shechinte, between the Holy Blessed One and the Shechina. Every time we say it. And there's a lot of Kabbalistic writing about actually how sound, vowels, even the ta'amin, even the trope, right, the notes that we used for cantillation, all of these are actually spirit and energy, vitality that's infused in the potentially dead letter. An interesting, actually, counter-polemic to the notion that you see actually in the New Testament of actually of the Tanakh, of the Torah, as being dead letters versus the Holy Spirit, right, the living Spirit of God. And actually, Kabbalah pushes back and say, no, actually, the Torah is alive. It is infused with vitality. It is infused with sound. And I think anybody who's sung, anyone who sings and infuses themselves into what it means to bring life to the written text of the score of the book of the, what's it called, the words for lyrics, but there's another term I'm forgetting. But to give life to these things, right? To give them sound, to give them movement, to give them dynamic energy, right? So Torah is enlivened, but it's enlivened through our engagement with it by breathing our spirit into it. So Adonai, but Adonai comes from the term Adon, right? Adonut, which means mastery, sovereignty. Hu more umeid al derech kabbalas hashefa v'koach mishem ekyeh and yud kei vav kei yisparach. This is testifying and telling us of the path or the mechanism of reception of the flow and the potency, the power, the energy, energia, from Keter and Tiferet. So we see the term Ehyeh, which is the name that God gives to Moses, saying, I will be what I will be. Doesn't that make sense then? That's associated with the Sefirah of will. I will be. Not just for the future tense, I will be, but will of I decide. I manifest as I choose. I will be. Keter, ratzon, will is futural. It is what you will do. It cannot be determined or restricted. Yud Kei Vav Kei is the Sefirah of being. So future, present, and then manifesting in Adonai, actualization, manifestation. Decision, will, being, and then actualizing in Adonai. So actualizing has to do with what you choose and your energy to do it. And Adonai brings you the new aspect of what does it mean to manifest these things. You can't just have potential. You can't just have capacity. You need to do it. To make your mark. To help the world go. And the term Malchus is the means of sovereignty, of governance, with the power, the potency of judgment, judiciousness, which stems from the power of the name Adonai. So, and we see this dynamic recapitulate, right? The Sefirot, like everything, is both going forward but also cycling in Judaism, like a calendar. The force and the power of energy is tempered by judgment. The power of love is received by and channeled in judgment. That you can act with power, but without that temperance, without the sobriety, without what it means to be mindful of what impact is, of what it means to receive it. And I think that's a really important point, is that Din is a receptive, Din is Gevura. It's reception. But to temper it with reception then is to be mindful of the experience of what it means to receive. And thus, for you to be able to influence, Shefa, flow, for you to be able to influence, to make your influence in this world, you always need to be thinking about how it can be taken in. Of what's too much, what's not wise, what's too soon. That all enactments of power, of potential influence, needs to be mindful of who is party to that act. It's always dialogical. It's never just you are doing it and whatever will be. That's a yeah. For you to bring it into this world, it's always done with the partnership of others. So, judgment is necessary. Otherwise, you overwhelm. You trample over. And here we come to the turn. Because we're moving from the more theoretical analysis of Yosef Chikatilia in his medieval masterwork, Sha'arei Ora, in which he's thinking about using the Torah as a map for your consciousness to travel up the Sefirot and rejoin with God. But Tomer Devora brings the energy the other way. Because the question he always asks is, Heach yargil ha'adam atzmai v'midos, da-da-da. How can a person create the habit, the regular habit, to regulate themselves, to habituate themselves in this practice or in this aspect of God, of Malchus. It's not just understanding how God is doing it, but now the question is, how do we bring it down into ourselves? And that's really the most Malchus-y question of all. And here, the reason I'm calling it the turn, the trope, is it could have gone the other way. This could have been, lo aleinu, Rahman al-Litzlan, it could have been a fascist theology. Very Nietzschean, of power. That is what actually signifies divinity and God. And thus, for you to manifest godliness is to manifest power, is to be big and strong, is to influence and is to manipulate others, is to constrain others. Now, we've already seen, I think, the hints in which, even as early as the level of the Tanakh, we know that that can't be true, because it's legadel lechazek lakol, right? To cultivate others' growth and to empower others. That's what power entails. Empowerment. Power is to be shared, is to be instilled, not to be possessed. But it could have gone that way. We have theologies in this world which have this way. Unfortunately, I think we're seeing more and more of that show up in some ways in the Jewish world. That now that, thank God, we have a position of security, one maybe we haven't known for a very, very, very long time, that security can easily turn into an unconscious utilization of that power. Not one of empowerment of others, but one of constantly being caught in what it means to dominate, to secure ourselves. And yes, so Susie mentioned the term arrogance, and I think it's not an accident that we see specifically that the most common theory of where the Sitra Achra, of where the other side, the demonic other side comes from, is it comes from Gevura. It comes from strength, right? Gevura means strength, power. But when strength gets imbalanced, it's not as a temperance of perhaps the overriding power of love, but rather it's seen as its own value, power for its own sake, turns into anger. And anger is associated with idolatry, because what you're worshiping is what you are devoted to is yourself in anger, because you are trying to magnify the ego, to control, to lash out. And God says actually that whenever someone is angry, right, that person actually it does not leave me space to be. So we have an incredibly radical model of what power entails, what Malchus entails, what it means to actualize as yourself, is that it cannot be over and against others. This is a value that I think we see a lot of popularity around Kabbalah, but I don't see a lot of what it means to really practice and embody what Kabbalah teaches in terms of a gentleness of spirit and a sense of internal security. And I think we'll see this here. So this is an incredible text that I do want to teach in extenso in the near future, God willing. So it's the Ramak, it's Moshe Cordovero, 16th century Sfas-based Kabbalist, predecessor to Isaac Luria. He says, what does it mean to practice Malchus? And the first thing he says is, we lower ourselves. We humble ourselves. What does it mean to have God's sovereignty? To possess, manifest, embody God's power. It means to humble yourself. I think, and who was the coolest kid in high school? Like the best jock, right? The best jock was nice, right? There was the insecure jocks who reinforced their self-image by bullying. But remember the cool kid that was also immensely kind? That's power. Power, real power, has a sense of ease. because to lash out means you need to reinforce it. But to be kind means you are secure in your having it. That to share it is not threatening. To help others, if anything, you realize again, to divide it is to multiply it. That's the logic of infinity. It's not the logic of the excluded middle. It's not what you lose you can't get back. It's that what you share is multiplied. I do think that, just think, if we translate to like a micro scale, I think we can think a lot of ways of what it means to be possessing and to be ensuring inside of ourselves what it means to practice the value of, again, God's power. The value of manifesting and actualizing, embodying God's power is one of humility. And it's that incredible seeming contradiction, that reversal, that paradox, that I think empowers something that's immensely, that like it's an engine that is an incredibly powerful engine. Because again, it's not power that's aimed towards its possession or its retention, it's power aimed towards its actualization, its sharing, its empowerment of others. It's a very different model of power. I think fear is at the heart of a lot of what keeps us from being able to start from a place of cooperation. And I think there's a lot of reasons that people feel scared. And that's why I also think it's really important to try to, I think key to this is healing. I think that we'll see that soon. So Rishona L'Kulan, and per Susie's point earlier, Shelo Yisgaya Liboy B'chol Asher Lei. First of all, you do not become arrogant, prideful. You do not become arrogant in your heart, in any way, shape, or form. V'yasim atzmai tamid ka'ani, and always consider yourself as impoverished. V'yamid atzmai lifnei kono kedal shoel mischanen. And you stand before God, you set yourself up before God, before your Creator, like somebody who is in need, who's asking and begging and pleading. This is actually the radical power of Malchus, of Shekhinah. Shekhinah is, on one hand, facing us, the governor of the entire cosmos. But on the other hand, facing the source, is the recipient and the one who needs it all. Malchut embodies both the distribution and the need, the vulnerability and the mastery. It's that paradox that we dwell in. And to habituate oneself in this characteristic, afilu shia asher yachshiv she'en davek imo. Even if you become rich, all the more so you need to remember that it doesn't really belong to you. V'hu ne'ezav tzarich l'rachmei habore tamid. And that it could easily go away. And everything's dependent on God's mercy. Everything you think you possess, you don't really own. You are in charge of it for a moment. And you could spend your life trying to keep it. Or you could always maintain a consciousness of what it means to be without it. And then what does that bring you into alignment with? With whom does that bring you into alignment? With other people who need. If you see your osher, your wealth, as osher, fortune, right? The word fortune, right? Like I made a fortune the other day in the lottery. But fortune also means luck. Your fortune, your luck is dependent on something beyond you. So it's not actually proper to you. It is not essential to you. It is, in the philosophical terms, accidental to you. It is like you having brown hair. It is not like you being your soul. And to maintain a sense of what real priorities are, what you really need. She'ein lo kol davar elo halechem asher ochel. To never forget what you really need versus just what you want or what it's nice to have. That all you need is really the bread that you eat. And you bring your heart down. And you empty yourself out. Umagam be'est filosav shezo segula nifla. And this is how to approach your prayer. And then he gives the opposite of what it's like. He says, David HaMelech, literally the model we have for the king. And we know that Malchus is associated with the Sefirah of David. Now, every Sefirah is associated with a different figure from our history, from our Torah. And Malchus, David HaMelech, right, is associated with Malchus. And David, he behaved himself, but he behaved in such a way, in this way. Ki yachid v'ani ani. I am but a lowly person. Shari kol anshe beso kol echav yachad tzarich lihe'azer la'atzmo. Because if each and every person had to help themselves, ma kulam elu afilu ishto vanav moyo ilu bihotu nishpat lifnei abore o be'esiluk nishmaso. Right? If he left everybody to fend for themselves, right? The laissez-faire paradise of a self-created individual, right? Auto-poetic, to create yourself. This fantasy we have of heroism, of self-creation. First of all, who does that displace? God, who created us. And secondly, it also creates a hierarchy within the world of those who were able to manifest the best, the most, have the most power, have the most wealth, what have you, and those who weren't. And he says, what does that say of David when he goes to meet his maker? I left my household to fend for themselves. I left my nation to fend for themselves. I left the world to fend for itself. I let everyone be potentially their own David. Oh, that sounds nice. But that misses what it means to be in a position of potential influence. It misses that you have a potential to act and you have a responsibility to do so. He says, everyone will escort them to his grave. Mahim lo be'estinov. He'll have no one to speak on his behalf. Everyone will speak on their own behalf. As from the moment he enters his final resting place and onwards. Lefichach yashpil v'yisaki natzami v'soda midazes. Thus, one needs to bring oneself down. Here I want to say something really important. Well, we'll see if it's important. But here I want to make a point. Because I think there's been actually a necessary kind of swing of the pendulum of, let's say, the aspects of spirituality which stress humility. Because we have really unhealthy models of what that kind of humility looks like. And they're models that are used to debase us, or to make us feel ignoble, to make us feel worthless. And I think this is a rehabilitation of that, I think. Because this is in no way, shape, or form a model for like a vehicle for self-abuse or for self-demeaning. Demeanment. This is rather a radical practice of maintaining a connection with everyone in the world, regardless of social position. It is not something that brings you down as unique. Bringing you down in this like uniquely like terrible way. Oh, I'm nothing. I'm awful. I'm terrible. It's actually just another way of. It's just the reverse side of heroism. It's the reverse side of adventurism. It's this fantasy of actually how you are in truth really, really, really special. It's just that you're really, really bad. But this is a model actually that focuses on connection with others, not of isolating yourself as uniquely terrible or uniquely wonderful. This is a model of interconnectivity in which you bring yourself down because you bring yourself to earth. That you don't let your luck become a way for you to float away, but rather it brings you, I think, into a mindset of solidarity with other people who are in need. Because the truth is, you remember that you're fundamentally human. And what it means to be human is to be vulnerable, to be potentially in need. And thus, you becoming lucky, wealthy, powerful, doesn't make you a different class of person. It makes you the same person, but now with new opportunities to bring sustenance and empowerment to others. And this is not hashpala, this is not to be yashpil es atzmai, to lower yourself in terms of demeaning yourself or abnegating yourself, but I think it's lowering yourself to maintain a sense of having your feet and your fingers to touch the pulse of the ground, to stay in connection with the ground on which we all stand. God, it says actually in the specifically Nusach Sfard, it says in Nusach Ashkenaz it just says Mashpil Geim. God casts down the proud, casts down the arrogant. But in Nusach Sfard it says Magbia Shefalim. That God casts down the arrogant, yes, but also raises up those who are down. The truth is that it's really about humility as a practice of dignity, not as a practice, not as an excuse for self-punishment. Humility is empowerment because it keeps our minds pointed towards what it really means to practice power, which is towards the betterment of others. It is not about self-magnification, self-glorification. I think there's been an important corrective in terms of the ways in which I think there has been a way to smuggle in self-destruction or self-demeanment. But here what we have is a deeply connective and interconnective model of what it means to have the power and the potential to act and to keep your attention on who needs this attention the most. I mean, this, if only, but this is it. This is it. This is what it means. This is the flow of Shefa, the coursing, an energetic flow that stems from the source of existence, that courses into reality. Its terminus, its endpoint, its actualizing is not in conquest, but is in empowerment. God charges us to charge others. Malchus is also never loses consciousness of what it means to be in need. That's what it means to have power. And here, I'll leave this on the outside, but here I'll say, we'll do this not inside, but outside, in the sense that there's a practice that the Ramak wrote about, which is called, in a book called Sefer Girushin, a book of exiles, in which there was a Kabbalistic practice to walk around the Galilee barefoot, just go on these peripatetic walks, and to eventually find yourself at the graves of the ancestors and to prostrate yourself on them, communing with the spirits, all kinds of intense stuff. But what does it mean to be in Malchus? Back to Shosha's point in terms of what it means to be, let's say, become too comfortable in terms of your relationship to controlling space. What does it mean to have dominion and sovereignty? Is to go into exile. That's an incredible reversal. Which is the aspect of God that it goes into Gullus with us? Shechina. Shechina doesn't stay in the holy space. Shechina helps us remember it's all holy space because the point is attending to the presence of God. But what does it mean, again, to have control, to have power? Is to displace yourself, to misplace yourself, to lose yourself. Because that, I think, so what we see here, it's incredible. What we see is that the practice of power is to decenter, not to barrel down, but to displace yourself, to look elsewhere and outside, to not just become cozy and comfortable and defending, your, what's it called? What are those laws in Florida? Stand your ground laws, or castle doctrine, right? You're always, what does it mean to stay in one space? It's to defend it from encroachment. Lock down the borders, right? Keep the hordes from flowing in. Spheros consciousness, a practice of embodying the Spheros, is a practice of flow. It's not a practice of stopping things from coming in. It's a practice of what it means to accept and then to give. So he has this practice of actually, what does it mean to embody what it means to bring God into the world? It's to go elsewhere, to look for where else God can be, to find other spaces in which God's presence can be discovered, and also God's presence can be, let's say, kivyachol, brought. To not restrict yourself to the special place, to your place, to the place that you control, but to go outside your comfort zone and to try to find ways to remember what it's like to not be locked down, locked in. To have power is to go into exile. It's not just to go into, to put yourself in, because it's a practice he talks about. And the point of it is empathy. You go into exile to feel the presence of Shekhinah, the vulnerability of Shekhinah in exile. And the manifestation of Shekhinah in exile is all of the brokenness that we see in this world. But the point of it is not to shield yourself from it, it is to attend to it and to use what you can to bring healing to it. God has the sovereignty and governs in the nations. It's not just at your home space. It is going out into the world. Okay. So here's where I want to close. Although, of course, there's a bunch of text. But there's a phrase that pops up again and again and again, especially in Hasidic literature, but also in the Meforshim. Ein melech below am. There's no king without a nation. A very early example of dialectical thinking, right? And I think that's exactly what we've been seeing. That we've seen the paradox of power. That real power in Torah thinking, Malchus, sovereignty, is not its retention and possession to have power, but to disperse it and to practice it, to displace yourself, decenter yourself, not to stay secure and not to shore up your defenses, but rather to give it away, to make sure you stay connected to those who need you, to find those who need you by going out and finding them. So power is never something that is unidirectional. It's not just held by one party. Power is something that is shared. So when we say Ein Melech below Am, we actually have this, on one hand, an undermining of this notion of power, that you can only have power if it's recognized by others. But also we see the point that we saw before about David. Right, like the absurdity of a king going around saying, I'm your king, and people are like, what? Who? What kind of king is that? A king only makes sense in the sense that the king is involved with others. Power is differential. Power is dialogical. Power is involved. Power is practiced. Torah is a model of counsel. It says God took counsel in the Torah in creating the world. God didn't just create the world willy-nilly. God asked advice. And it says, a real power, kol malchus she'en la yoatzim ein malchusa malchus. Any kingdom without counselors is not without say counselors like counsel, like a lawyer, a minister, someone that you seek counsel from, right? Any kingship without counselors is not really a kingship. A king is not acting alone, or a king that acts alone is not being a king, being an idiot. What it means to have power is to be wise. Kater techochma. To bina. It's to recognize you need others. That you need to seek advice. You need to seek other people's perspective to make up what you missed. There's a lovely novel I read earlier in the pandemic called The Goblin Emperor. A really, really nice kind of critique, subtle, gentle critique of a lot of like speciesism that you see in fantasy literature. Like, oh, there's the noble-looking, beautiful humans, and then there's the orcs. So here we have a goblin who ends up actually like a half goblin, half human, who ends up being the rightful heir to the throne, and the difficulty he has navigating that. But he ends up ruling with wisdom and with temperance because he starts from a place of humility. Because he didn't grow up arrogant. He grew up occupying a precarious position in society because he was half goblin. And he used that as wisdom to seek advice from other people, to develop a strong team of people he could ask questions from. It shows that that the best practices of power are not the ones that are the most arbitrary, but are really the ones that are most temperate. Kol malchus ein la yoatzim ein malchusa malchus. Even God asks advice. Na'aseh adam b'tzalmenu kidmutenu. Let us make human being in our image and in our likeness. Who's this us? Are there many gods? Obviously not. God is inquiring, seeking counsel from the angelic court. Or God is looking in the Torah for wisdom. God models what it is to practice power dialogically. If anyone doesn't need anyone else, it's God. So then what's God doing by asking advice? God is wise. How could God not? Does God need to? No. You also don't need to. But it's not good. It's not wise. God models wise behavior. God models a mature practice of power. Power could easily be an excuse for immaturity. You know, they say like a celebrity acts the way that they were once they became famous, right? Like a 40-year-old celebrity that became famous when they're 20 always acts like they're 20. Because that's when they stop developing. Because now they have people to take care of things for them, right? They didn't have the opportunity, they didn't have the necessity of what it means to mature. The humblings that life entails. Power could easily become an excuse for being immature, for being arbitrary, for being selfish. And it often, unfortunately, we see examples of that. But a mature practice of power, what it means to actualize and manifest yourself as a venue, a space for God, is to empower others and to practice cooperation and collaboration. Says the Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. Okay. So I want to bring us to our last text. It is definitely a Voltron theory of power. Thank you very much, Yilsai. Or Captain Planet. Right? When our powers combine. Okay. So I want to leave us with the words of Rabbi Nachman. The best Torah here from the Kesser Shem Tov focuses on how actually every mitzvah we perform is an opportunity to do this. But Rabbi Nachman actually expands on that, and I think we're running short on time, so I want to make sure to to be mindful of that. And I think, again, there's something radically transformative about this model of power that starts with this very notion of Ein Melech Below Am. There's a really powerful reinterpretation of Rosh Hashanah by the Pachad Yitzchak Hutner, known as the Rosh Yeshiva, who was the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivas Chaim Berlin in the Lower East Side, who wrote an incredible series of books called Pachad Yitzchak. Although his daughter actually helped co-write a number of them. His daughter actually got a PhD from Columbia, my alma mater. Very good PhD. So in one of his treatments of Rosh Hashanah, he really focused on this notion of Ein Melech Below Am. Then the notion of Rosh Hashanah, it's not just that we recognize God's kingship, we actually crown God as king. And he's like pausing and like meditating on this. That Rosh Hashanah is like actually a deeply, not just, it is not the day in which we are subject to judgment. It is the day we practice judgment because we decide to re-elect God. We could not. We might not. What if we all just become Kofrim tomorrow? Like we just say, I'm not doing Rosh Hashanah. Sorry, I'm not re-upping God's contract. God has a 1-year contract and I'm not re-upping it anymore. We could do that. But there's something about, again, the security, the subtleness, and the true power of what it means to leave it up to others. Because real practice of power requires trust. If you don't have the security to trust, you don't really have power. If you are constantly battening down the hatches, that is a position of insecurity. But to entrust Am Yisrael, right, the people of Israel, with a responsibility or the option to re-elect God every year, that's a very different model of what a king is. A king that is elected because God trusts that we'll re-up. There's a benevolence to what it really means to have power. God empowers us and thus sets the model for us to practice power by empowering others. So Rabbi Nachman says, Iker tachlis brias oilamos. And this is really the thrust of this whole shiur. Malchus as manifestation, actualization. The point, the essential purpose of creating the world was for the sake of Malchut. What does he mean by that? For the sake of actualization. Hainu kedei legalus malchusai, to reveal, to make apparent, to disclose God's sovereignty. Shezeh efshar ki'im al yedei ha'olamos. But that would be impossible without the world. Ein melech below am. A king locked up in the tower who never goes out is not a king. There needs to be a world for God to be sovereign. But I want to flip it. It's not just God needs a stage on which God can play the part of king, turning it all into this egoistic fantasy. It's that for God to actualize as God, and actually I want to say for God to manifest, actualization as such, the world needs to be. That's a bit trippy, but let me unpack that. The world being created is a model for actualization. God creating nature, creating the cosmos, is God committing to manifestation. It could have just stayed a thought in God's mind. The world. Could go like, the world. That'd be cool. But God made it happen. And by making it happen, God models the commitment to act. to actualize, to manifest. Not just to stay up here, but to be down here. God does it. And it sets the template for us. Ki ein melech below am. We leave ourselves unfulfilled, as God would be, kivyachol, unfulfilled, without the world. We need to manifest. That's the premise and the promise of Malchus. Uvishvil zeh, and this is huge, haya hatzimtzum shalach halal panui. And for this sake, God contracted God's self and made the empty space. Zoom back up to the Ramak. What does it mean to have Malchus? Humility. God, for the sake of actualizing, contracted God's self for the sake of others. So there could be others. So there could be a world. Back to Shosha's point. It takes a consciousness of space to practice power. That Malchus entails both bringing yourself in, but also making space for others. It's both hashpa, actualization, and tzimtzum, making the space for others. Immature power doesn't get that. It just spews all over. Mature, godly practices of power, of self-actualization, understand that it is both what you give and how you help. It's how you bring yourself in and also how you make space for others to do that as well. That's a gift as well. That's a true consciousness of power, is that you don't see it as a self-lessening. You see that actually as what it means to possess. Kedei sheyeh makom lebrias ha'olam. So there would be space for the worlds to be created. Kedei sheyisgala malchusa yisbarach. So that God's actualization could be made manifest. God's actualization can only be through attention to others. Without that, God can't manifest, because all you have is just the space of self. It needs to be participatory, it needs to be other-minded, and it needs to be radically attentive to really be what it means to have the capacity to act. So we have here, I think, we're caught in this beautiful challenge. And the challenge is, on one hand, as we've been talking about, to dig into ourselves, to find the different aspects of ourselves that are justly deserving of praise and of development, of attention. But there's a risk, I think, in a lot of like Midos work and Musar work and Sefirot work and stuff, because it becomes this very self-oriented fantasy of self-perfection, self-development, self-manifestation. And Malchus, I think, adds the necessary corrective that has to happen at the punctuated end of this movement of the sonata of our lives. That Malchus is an end to thinking of ourselves. I don't mean a cessation of it. I mean the end of thinking of ourselves. End can also mean purpose. The end of thinking of ourselves is how we manifest in the world, how we attend to others, how we help, how we give, and how we, I think, are able to channel the best of us, but not for the sake of us. it's an incredible paradox the Kabbalah gives us, but one actually that makes all the sense in the world when we can find the space of peace to practice it. So I think here I'll pause, not end, and I will say what a zechus it's been, what a privilege it's been to learn, to travel and to journey with you these past bunch of weeks. There will be an announcement for the next class. Please feel free to add suggestions. We will have Parsha chat on Thursdays, 7:30. Kabbalah Shabbos, probably also around 7:30. And Havdalah, but not just Havdalah, will also be doing a joint program, a Tikkun pre-Shavuot, with Annex Shul and Makom and Toronto Partnership Minion and Eshel Toronto. We'll have a couple hours plus of learning from teachers around the community. So that'll be at 9:45, and we'll start with Havdalah. So that'll be our Havdalah program. Shavuos is Sunday night through Tuesday, so get your blintzes ready. And I think really, we've been traveling from the spark explosion of the moment of liberation at Pesach. And then the process of the Omer carries us through us learning of ourselves again after we stripped ourselves bare and we cleaned up all of our chametz. We really burnished the pot of our soul. And we got down to the brass nubs. And Sefirot ha-Omer is us building ourselves back up, but hopefully in a way that's growthful, in a way that is more self-knowing, more wise, such that now that we have the judicious opportunities, the gevura, to channel ourselves back into the world with Torah, right? Torah as the premise of it's not just Talmud, it's not just learning, it's Maisa. Right? Talmud gadol shemevi lidei Maisa, right? Learning is good because it brings you to manifestation. It brings you to practice. So for us to receive a Torah, we've created a vessel to receive it, and that vessel is ourselves. Our spheres are also called kalim. But as we've learned about each and every sefira, it receives and it gives. So we receive the Torah, but now going through the Omer, we've learned not just how to take it in, and chas v'shalom, as we've learned with Malchut, not ever to keep it, to capture it, but what it means to let it go, what it means to practice it in the world, what it means to give it to others. So it's a deeply exciting moment for us to start again. So thank you all, and I'm gonna stop the recording, but we'll have some chance just to talk about what it means to try to commit. Malchut is a sphere of commitment. So may I wish all of us the resilience we need to commit. Shkach.